Mr. Norvell, thank you for agreeing to provide your history to the New Mexico State Bar Senior Lawyers Division Oral History Project. I'd like to start off with your early life. First of all, how would you like to be addressed throughout this? I know you've had a number of different titles throughout your career.
Yeah, Mr. Norvell.
That's fine. Mr. Norvell, tell me about your early life. Where were you born?
I was born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1935.
And how many siblings did you have?
I had none.
You were an only child?
Only child.
What were your parents' occupation?
Well, my father was an accountant, and I moved to Bartlesville, Oklahoma soon after I was born as a baby, and my father went to work for Phillips Petroleum Company in their home office in Bartlesville as a comptroller and worked there until he retired. My mother was a housewife.
So you grew up in Bartlesville?
I did.
After Bartlesville, where did you go next?
Well, after I graduated from high school, I went to Northeastern State College in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Got a bachelor's degree there in history and speech, and then went to the University of Oklahoma Law School.
When did you graduate undergraduate?
Undergraduate, I graduated in 1955.
And law school?
1958.
So you went straight through undergraduate, straight to law school?
Straight through, and then on the day after my final exam at Oklahoma University, I moved to Clovis, New Mexico.
Well, let's go back a moment. What inspired you to go on to law school from undergraduate?
Well, when I was, I had no idea what I was going to do when I went to college. I guess that's just when you major in history, when you don't know what you're going to do. And but I became very interested in debate and speech, and my professor in debate started grooming a friend of mine who was in school with me, Jim Summerlin, to participate in debate contests around the country, and we went to the national debate competition in California my senior year and participated in the national debate and went to the quarterfinals in that. And anyway, based upon his tutoring and my interest in that, it just seemed like maybe law school was the place to go. And so that was the reason I ended up in law school, together with my debating partner in college. Both of us went to Oklahoma at the same time.
And any particular reason why you chose Oklahoma, other than that's the fact where you lived?
Well, at that time, there was two law schools. Well, I guess Tulsa had a law school. Oklahoma State did not. So there were only two law schools, and I just, for whatever reason, preferred to go to Oklahoma, to Norman. I think it got kind of farther away from home. But Tulsa was only 50 miles from Bartlesville, so I think maybe I was trying to get a little ways from home. How
large was the law school class in which you graduated?
Well, when we graduated, I think there were about 50 or 60. I think it started at about 150, 175 when we sat down on the first day of class, I guess, which is sort of usual. They said, look to your right, look to your left, because one of you is not going to be here when you get through, and I think it turned out to be more than one. I think about a third of our class finished.
Did you take the bar in Oklahoma?
I took the bar. I moved out to Clovis on June the 5th. My last exam was June 4th of 1958, and I moved to Clovis June the 5th, and then had to go back to Oklahoma on about the 27th or 26th of June to take the Oklahoma bar, and then came out and took the New Mexico bar in August of 58.
How is it that you remember the date of June the 5th?
Because I know that my second child was born on June 5th the following year, and so I had been in when he was born. I'd been in New Mexico for a year.
So you were married when you were in law school?
I got married when I was between my second and third year.
How did you handle being married as well as going to law school?
Well, I don't know. I made much better grades after I got married. I guess I spent less time at the pub. But my wife worked at University Press at the university, and it worked out fine. It provided, I guess, just a better atmosphere for studying than I had the first 2 years.
What led you to New Mexico as opposed to practicing in Oklahoma?
Well, I just didn't care for Oklahoma for a number of reasons. One, it was terribly, although I didn't realize it as much when I was there until I left, but it was awfully hot and humid there. And so I sent out before our Easter break in 1958, I sent out letters in New Mexico and Colorado and Arizona for asking for interviews. And so during that break, my wife and I came to all three of those states and interviewed at a variety of places. And I received 3 or 4 offers, and one was from a gentleman in Clovis by the name of D. Blythe. And we seemed to like Clovis better than some of the places. We were sort of looking for a smaller town about the size where I grew up. Bartlesville and Clovis are about the same size, and so I just chose that place and went there, and it worked out well.
Other than the speech professor that you told me about, are there any other individuals that you would look at as either educational or professional role models that you looked to in those early years?
Well, probably not. I think my professor, in high school, I had a professor who was a principal at my junior high and then principal at the high school, named Levi Muncie. He was a role model of mine. He was also my tennis coach, and that was my main interest in high school, was playing tennis. And in fact, that's why I went to Northeastern as a tennis scholarship, and played tennis for those 3 years, and played tennis more than I studied. And
but you still got into law school.
Well, at that time there wasn't real stringent requirements like there are now. And in fact, as my recollection is, I applied and they sent back and said, "Come on down." So that was about the size of that. And about after my first year, they were about to say, "Go back home," but I didn't make very good grades my first year in law school. I didn't realize you were supposed to study.
Did you maintain any contact with your debate professor when you got into law school?
Never did. Never saw him again.
Okay.
Never saw him again.
You said that you were married. How many children did you have while you were in law school?
Oh, none. I didn't have any when we were in law school. My first child, Teresa, who is a teacher in San Diego now, was born on the night after my last day of the Oklahoma bar exam. So I came home after the exam, went to bed, and got up about 2 in the morning and took my wife to the hospital.
And you have how many children?
Well, I had 5. One of them died of heart problems a couple of years ago, but I have 4 children now.
And who are they?
Teresa's the oldest. She was born in 1958, and she lives in San Diego, and she's a teacher, has been all of her life, professional life. My second daughter, Felicia, she went to Oklahoma University Law School, and she was born in 1960, and she practices law now in Dallas. And my youngest daughter is Connie. She was born in 1966, and she is 1963. I'm sorry, and she is now in the real estate business, which is not too prosperous in Las Vegas, Nevada, at the moment. Although she spent most of her time in the casino business, from Tahoe, Reno, and Las Vegas until about 5 years ago, when she finally had enough smoke-filled rooms and quit that and went into the real estate business.
So they're all...
And then my son, I have a son, my youngest child is a son, he lives in Las Vegas as well. He's in the construction business.
So the family has moved ever westward ever since they left Bartlesville.
Yep, except Felicia, who went back in that neighborhood.
And you're currently married?
I am married to Gail Chasey, who we were married in October of 2003, and she is from Phoenix originally, and she has she's got a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate in education, and is a legislator from the University Nob Hill area, has been for the last 10 years in the House, and she is now in law school and will hopefully graduate in May.
Sounds kind of ambitious.
She is an ambitious lady.
Do you have any grandchildren?
I do. My daughter in Dallas and Richardson, actually she lives in Richardson. She has 2 children. They're Nikki, she is 4, and Trentman is 7. And my daughter in Las Vegas, Connie, she has a son who is 13, Hayden.
Okay. What would you have as interests? What are your interests outside the law as far as your activities now?
Well, I have always been interested in the political environment, and because of that, I began that in the early '60s when I went to Clovis. I ran for the House of Representatives and was elected, and was elected 4 times, and that has really been probably the focus and center of my life, has been politics.
How old were you when you were elected the first time?
27. And anyway, I proceeded up the ladder in the House. I was, during my third term, I was elected Majority Floor Leader, and then in my last term, I was elected Speaker of the House in 1969. And then in 1970, I chose to not run again for the House and ran for Attorney General, and was elected Attorney General, and then my family had to move from Clovis to Santa Fe at that time, and I served 4 years as Attorney General, and then in midterm of my term as Attorney General, I ran for the United States Senate in the seat that was being vacated by Clint Anderson, and the year Pete Domenici was elected.
Let me ask you about the political environment back then. Who was governor when you first went into the State House?
Jack Campbell. First term it was Jack Campbell. He was Speaker before. Then Bruce King became Speaker when he left, but Jack was governor for 4 years. Those were two-year terms at that time, and two-term limit, and so he was elected for 4 years, and then Bruce King decided to run for governor in 1968 after Dave Cargo had gotten elected after Jack Campbell had gotten elected, and then on the second time when Cargo ran, Bruce ran against him, and he had lost though in the primary to Fabian Chavez. And so Fabian then was defeated by Cargo, and that left the Speaker's position open, and that's how I moved into that position at that time.
How was your working relationship with the governor?
Which one?
First one.
Jack Campbell? Oh, wonderful. I think he was just an outstanding governor. He did a lot of good things. Easy to work with, very open, and I enjoyed him very much. Too bad he couldn't have been governor for longer.
Who was President Pro Tem at that time?
President Pro Tem at that time, probably, I think it was a gentleman by the name of Wheatley from up in the northeast part of the state. Can't even think of his first name now, but I would guess that's who it was.
Would you say you worked more closely with the governor than you did with the senators?
I think it was probably about equal at that time when Campbell was there. When Cargo was governor, I'm sure I worked closer with the Senate than I did with Governor Cargo. Although we're very good friends now, we were a little contentious at that time.
Can't understand that. How was it working with Bruce King in his first administration?
Well, Bruce and I had been friends for a long time, but when I was Attorney General, one of the first things that I did was join with a number of attorneys general around the country who filed a lawsuit against Melvin Laird, who was Secretary of Defense, to try to extricate the United States from the war in Vietnam. And unfortunately, or I guess you would say, I did that without consulting with the governor, and he was not pleased with that move. And so we had a strained relationship for a while over that subject. He hired a general counsel to represent him in his office rather than relying always on the Attorney General's office for advice.
Okay.
Although we have been very good friends since.
Let me ask you.
Better friends since than then.
Let me ask you then, after I want to go back to your legal career when you started. What kind of work did you do over in Clovis?
When I first started, I did mostly criminal defense work. And at that time, as I'm sure you know, we didn't have anything called the public defender's offices around the state. And the people who were unable to afford counsel were provided counsel by the discretion of the district judges, and they would try to parcel out fairly among the bar people to defend, but they generally doled them out to the young lawyers, and so I got a good portion of those during my first few years in practice.
What type of cases were you handling over in Clovis?
Well, I handled all kinds. I mean, they were anything, rape cases, murder cases.
Really?
Yeah, and we got a fair sampling of the whole process. And
were you part of a two-man office?
There were just two of us. Mm-hmm.
And how much older of you than was your employer?
Oh my goodness, he must have been probably 30 years older than me, I would guess, probably pretty close to that. And then while I was in the legislature, we passed. I was chairman of what we call the. Now I can't think of the name of it. There was a committee, it's an interim committee that we recommended to the legislature that they form the Court of Appeals, and that was then put on the ballot for approval of constitutional amendment, and the Court of Appeals was established, and Governor Campbell appointed my partner to the Court of Appeal. Appointed the sitting district judge in Clovis to the Court of Appeals, and then appointed my partner to the district bench.
Who was the setting district judge?
That went to the Court of Appeals?
Right.
Judge Hensley.
Okay.
Can't think of his first name right now. Turner Hensley. And then D. Blythe went on the district bench, and then he was defeated when he ran for election the next time.
Who else was there only one judge over there at that point in time?
I believe that's right. There was. Soon after that, though, there was two, but I think right then there was only one.
Who was the next judge?
And that was Portales and Clovis, Roosevelt and Curry County. The other judge?
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember who filled that second judgeship over there. I think maybe it was Wesley Quinn. Might have been. I'm not positive of that.
Okay. Did you have anything more to do other than the legislation involving the Court of Appeals?
You mean for judicial-wise?
Right.
Well, we during that same interim committee, we recommended the abolishment of the justice of the peace system, and inaugurated the magistrate court system at the same time. So that was a major battle because the justices of the peace had as much political stroke as anyone in the state, but it was a very unfair system, and it was wrought with a number of things which we don't need to go into, but there was a lot of good reasons to abolish that system and inaugurate the magistrate system, which has worked relatively well.
How's your health at this point in time in your life?
It's pretty good, except for a few back surgeries that I've had. I had 3 open back surgeries since 2000, and so I think I used to be 6'2". I think I'm about 6'1" now after all the chopping they did on my back, but it seems to be holding up pretty well now. Still playing tennis, and so that's a good sign.
That's excellent. How long, well, first of all, tell us what your title is at the present time in your present position.
I'm chairman of the New Mexico Gaming Control Board.
How did that come about?
Well, it came about because one of the members of the Gaming Control Board resigned in 2006 and moved back to Hobbs, and so there was a vacancy, and the governor asked me if I would be interested in taking that position, and I was at the point where I was starting to give some thought to winding down my practice, although I was still enjoying it, but it was after 48 years at that time, it was getting to the point where I was, I guess, tiring a little bit of fussing with judges, and so I told him that I would do that. So you cannot, it's a full-time position, so you can't practice and, or you can't receive a salary from any, or income from any other source except passive income, and so I took that position, and I had already been on the chairman of the racing commission, and the governor, one of his concerns was to try to bring all the gambling interest into one arena so that they would be together, and so the racing commission now, office is right next door to us. They moved out here after Governor Richardson made that determination to try to join those two entities. And so I was chairman of that board, and so the racing industry and the gaming and the casino industry are really close together, because racetracks no one can have a casino unless they have a racetrack. So all of the racetracks and casinos are joined at the hip, and so it made some sense for me to come over to this position, and which I did, and I've enjoyed it. We regulate all of the casinos at the racetracks, and all the nonprofits who have the ability, the fraternal organizations have the ability to have as many as 15 slot machines in their establishments. So there are a lot of those around the state, and then we monitor the tribal gaming compacts with the Indian tribes, and so all of that keeps everybody around here pretty busy. We have a pretty big operation of about 65 people.
We were talking before the interview started, and you have also a law enforcement arm.
We do have. We have about 8 or 10 law enforcement, certified law enforcement officers that work with us, and their job, of course, is to basically monitor the casinos and the places where there are gaming machines, to be sure that there's strict enforcement of the rules and regulations of the board concerning how they are operated, and and we have some of them are stationed in one is stationed in Hobbs, one is stationed in Ruidoso and in Las Cruces and in Farmington, not now in Farmington, but will be. So we have them spread around where the casinos were located, where the racinos rather are located at the racetracks, so they can be there when because a lot of the troubles that we have are related to surveillance of the gaming floor of these casinos, because we're connected. We have a central monitoring system, and every machine in the state is funneled into our upstairs to our monitoring system, so that we can tell minute by minute what's happening on any machine that we want to look at, and we can disable any machine that we need to. And so, but we need, at the same time, we need to have people on the ground at those locations so that they can go out and view what's happening if there's a problem. So that's why we try to have a law enforcement officer at near each one of the racetrack venues.
Has your practice background that you had over the years assisted you in this job?
Oh, I'm sure that it has. Although technically I hold the law enforcement position on the board. Don Dutton is the attorney position on the board, and now Demesia Padilla is a CPA member on the board. That was the opening that was available when the governor asked me to take the position, and he considered the fact that having served as Attorney General, that gave me the law enforcement background that would qualify me to serve in that position. And but having said that, Frank Baca, who's our general counsel, and our legal staff, I work closely with them and looking at legal issues that come before the board.
Going back to your practice when you were over in Clovis, you indicated it was primarily criminal. Is that what continued with you through the legislature? When you were in the legislature, you were still continuing to do criminal cases in the civilian community?
Oh yeah, yeah. Although that can once that I moved into the civil area some. I started doing a lot of civil plaintiffs litigation as well while I was in Clovis, and then gradually, when the public defender offices came into operation, the private criminal practice dwindled for a lot of people, particularly in federal court, where the federal public defender's office has outstanding criminal defense lawyers working there, and the federal system is more, I think I'd call it lax in providing quote indigent, unquote defendants with public lawyers than state is or used to be anyway. I don't think they have to meet such a financial threshold as they do in the state. So I would say the public defender in the federal system handles a lot more cases than the private sector does anymore.
Tell me about some of the attorneys that you worked with over in Clovis when you started off. Who was in the DA's office at that time?
Well, James Compton, I believe, was the district attorney at that time, and his father was on the bench, the Supreme Court bench, James Compton, at the same time. But I worked with, back in the 1950s and 60s, practicing law was a lot different than it is in 2000. Everybody knew everybody, they knew their family, they knew their children, and it was just one big community, or small community actually. And so I would say, everybody, we'd have bar association meetings once a month, and everybody'd go out and have a good time. And the relationship between lawyers and even in litigation was civil at that time. A lot of camaraderie in the legal system. I think even in Albuquerque at that time, probably not as much as in smaller cities, but I don't think I would say I was closer to one than I was another one. We were just all very close friends.
How many attorneys were there in
I think
Clovis,
there were probably
then?
about 15.
15?
Yeah.
In the whole town?
On the whole town.
Okay.
Not on the same block.
Sometimes you're on one side and sometimes you're on the other. Okay. Let me ask you a question about your professional associations. What do you belong to at this time in your life?
Oh, I belong to the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association. And right now I think that's the only one. After I stopped practicing, although I've kept my license current, I dropped some of my associations, like with the American Bar Association and the National Criminal Defense Association, and have only maintained that one, and then the New Mexico Bar Association.
Let me ask you a question. After your term ended in the House, your third term or fourth term did you say?
Well, I served 4 terms.
That you went on and ran for Attorney General.
Right.
What led you to that decision?
Well, after you get that deep involved in the political process, you start looking ahead of what the future holds, and some of these things become stepping stones, or hopefully become stepping stones. And I always I always enjoyed the legislative process, and I knew after I left Clovis, though, that I had no particular base in any particular legislative district to go back there, and I looked forward to potentially serving in the Congress, and if I, to be frank, by that point in time, the district that I was representing in Clovis was more Republican than it was Democrat, and I wasn't absolutely certain that, based upon my voting record, that I was going to be reelected to another term. I probably could have, but it wasn't a cinch. So I decided that I would, well, actually, the way it happened, if you want to know the true facts of it, one morning in February of 1970, during the 30-day session, Jerry Apodaca was he was in the state Senate at that time, and he was chairman of the Democratic Party. And Jack Daniels was a member of the House of Representatives, where I served as Speaker. And Bruce King, of course, having lost the race in 1968, was interested in running again in 1970, as was I, and as was Jack Daniels. And so one morning before we went into session, Jerry Apodaca asked Jack and Bruce and myself if we would agree to meet with him to see if we could avoid a primary battle for the governor's office. And so we met in the Speaker's office for about an hour and a half, and from that meeting came what we perceived to be an agreement that I would abandon my intention to run for governor, and I would run for Attorney General. Bruce King, at least we thought, had agreed to run for lieutenant governor, and Jack Daniels was going to run for governor, which was going to avoid a primary battle. It's not clear yet exactly what any misunderstanding arose, but the next day in the Tribune, Governor King announced for governor, and that sort of caused a little difficulty, but I still went ahead and ran for Attorney General. Jack went ahead and ran for governor, and Bruce beat him, and so that's history. That's exactly how I decided to run for Attorney General.
When you ran, how old were you?
Well, let's see, 70. I was 70. I was 35.
When you went into the Attorney General's office, you won that election.
I did.
When you went into the Attorney General's office, how many attorneys did it have at that time?
We had 12.
12.
12 attorneys. Yeah.
And what were some of the issues that you were facing at that time when you first went in?
Well, there weren't any major issues. Of course, the first issue, as I've already discussed, was the one that didn't receive the approval of the governor, but that was not a state issue particularly. We at that time, although we only had 12 attorneys in our office, most agencies had their own attorneys, and then we would designate them as assistant attorney generals. That's still true to some extent, but of course the office is huge now. I think there's over 100 lawyers in the office now. But in terms of monumental issues, I I can't remember any that were of great significance. I think one of the issues that came up was 18-year-old voting rights, because the Voting Rights Act of 1970, which was passed by the Congress, really only dealt with federal elections, and so the dilemma was that 18-year-olds could vote in federal elections in New Mexico, but you had to be 21 to vote in state elections. We tried to resolve that matter and did. However, it was done based upon legislation, not upon something that we did, although we encouraged the issue to try to get that uniform, which it finally was, because the Congress finally passed a comprehensive bill that would cover that, which was adopted by the states in 1971. But so that was an issue. One of the issues that we addressed was access to the ballot. When I went into office, and when I ran for the Senate, the filing fees were enormous to run for federal office in New Mexico. Something like $3,500, $4,000 filing fees, which we thought was denying access to people that would otherwise run. And so we filed a lawsuit in federal court to contest those filing fees, and were successful. And I can't remember exactly how it finally came out, except that the filing fees were dramatically reduced. When, in fact, in that Senate race in '72, there were probably going to be about 5 candidates in that race. I think Governor Cargo was going to run, and Domenici were going to run on the Republican ticket, and Jack Daniels and I were going to run on the Democratic ticket. And then we got this issue resolved about access to the ballot after the filing date, but before the election. And as a result of that, the filing fees were reduced to something like $500 or $200 or something like that. And 17 people filed in the Democratic Senate primary, and I think about 7 filed in the Republican primary because of that. So I guess you could say we succeeded in our effort to provide access to the ballot, although it turned out to be a real a mess. Not very many of those 17 got many votes, but anyway, they had their chance.
What would you describe your term in the Attorney General's office as that of an activist?
Well, some people would call it that. We had I don't know if you recall there was a big Reyes Tijerina Lopez was around during that period of time, and a lot of his associates and activists were causing some difficulties, and there was a big I don't know if you'd call it a raid or not, but there was a big group of activists that stormed the city hall and the police station, and back in I don't know if it was late 71 or 72, and I got involved in that to try to bring some calm to the situation, which didn't work. At Roosevelt Park was where it all finally ended up, and anyway, people were going down the streets throwing rocks through windows at Gallus Chevrolet on Central Avenue there close to the university, and it turned out to be a real brawl. And so if being an activist is trying to bring calm to something, it didn't work on that occasion, and I'm sure it didn't help my bid for the United States Senate, although I thought an activist position would have been trying to get us out of the war in Vietnam, and other people thought that too. But in terms of legal issues, though, I don't think that there was any during that 4-year period any great monumental legal issues that came before us that deserved any particular attention.
Did the Attorney General's office at that time do any special prosecutions where they were asked to handle prosecutions for murder trials, for example?
For district attorneys who had
Right.
conflicts and things of that nature. I think we had we got a few of those, but as is the case now, they still generally refer them to other district attorneys, but sometimes they would refer them to us.
Who were your assistant attorneys general back then?
Well, Ollie Payne was my deputy, and I had a gentleman by the name of Tom Dunnigan. He still practices in Santa Fe. Pat Whalen practices in Santa Fe. Ann Bingaman was one of my assistants. Andrea Bazard. Jay Rosenthal, who I haven't seen or heard of for many, many years. I'll probably think of some more, but those are some of them that I can think off the top of my head. There wouldn't be more. I guess that's about half of them.
Were you in the legislature during the T.R. Maria
I was.
event?
I was a majority floor leader in the House at that time.
How did that impact on your role as a legislator at that time?
Well, it got me in trouble with the governor, who was Dave Cargo at the time. He was. I think we were trying to propose some resolutions to that, and I can't remember all the details of it, but we were, I think, wanting to be a little more active in trying to settle that thing down, and the governor decided that it was his job, not ours, to be involved in that, and that he would appreciate if we keep our hands out of it.
And told you that?
In so many words.
Okay. When did you move your practice from Clovis?
Well, after I left the Attorney General's office, I practiced in Santa Fe for about a year, and then I moved it to Albuquerque in 1975, or early 1976.
During that period of time, were you always a solo practitioner? Did you have any partners?
I was a sole practitioner until I formed a partnership with a gentleman by the name of Randy Glover in probably about 1980, 81, 82, somewhere along in there, Randy Glover. We practiced together for 2 or 3 years as a partnership, and then that broke up, and I went back to sole practitioner, although I've associated with and been officed with same attorneys for a long time, Billy Blackburn, Bob Cooper, and some of those folks that did a lot of criminal defense work.
Tell me about some of the more, if you can, some of the more significant cases or particular cases that you recall that were interesting in your career.
Well, I think I mentioned one to you earlier when we were having lunch about, which probably one of the more interesting was I was hired by a gentleman by the name of Cornelius Patterson in Hobbs to defend him on a murder charge, and he had been charged with killing a prominent Hobbs citizen by the name of Grimes. It was alleged that he had or was having an affair with this gentleman's wife, and at some time during that relationship, this gentleman was shot as he was going out of his back door one evening to turn off the lights in his garage. My client was charged with that crime, and there was very little tangible or forensic evidence to tie him to the murder, except for possibly the romantic relationship he had with this gentleman's wife. But because of all of the publicity it received, the venue was changed to Eddy County in Carlsbad, and all of the judges in the 5th District recused themselves, and Gene Franchini, who was fairly new to the bench at that time, having replaced, I think, Bob McBride as the judge, because Bob McBride was a senator and was appointed by Jerry Apodaca, then it was determined that that was unconstitutional, and so he had to give that up, and I think Gene was appointed. And I know this was Gene's first murder trial that he had tried, and so this was a case that went to trial in Carlsbad, and then Lee Cathy was the district attorney, and it lasted about 2 weeks. It started in December, and I know Gene's, of course, always pleasant to have as your judge or as a dinner partner or anything in between, and so he was a great selection for this particular case because there were a lot of twists and turns in it that were of interest, but he brought his family down and everybody enjoyed the 2 weeks there. The case finally went to the jury on Christmas Eve, and I think, as I told you, the jury was, it seemed to me, tilted toward the conservative side, which you would expect in Artesia, particularly in Eddy County. And so one of the primary issues in that case was whether or not the government would be successful in obtaining a lesser included instruction of second-degree murder. And my client and I, after long and tedious discussions, decided to oppose that on the basis that we were fairly hopeful that we had a case that would result in a not guilty verdict, even though the jury might not have seemed that way at the time. But if they had gotten a second-degree lesser included instruction, we were fearful that even though they might acquit on first degree, that they might drop down and convict him of second degree. So we took the chance of just going whole hog and just opposing the second degree lesser included instruction, and the court denied the state's request, and so it went to the jury on that one charge alone, and so he was either going to be a free man or in jail for a long time, depending upon the result of the verdict. And on Christmas Eve, the jury came in with a not guilty verdict, and we weren't surprised, but we were very happy. And I don't know if you want me to tell you the rest of that story.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting.
After the courtroom cleared and the jury left the courthouse, Gene Franchini was still sitting on the bench, and the attorneys for both sides were still there with our client. And Gene said, "Mr. Norvell, I would like to see you and your client in chambers." And we said, fine, and so Mr. Patterson and I went in, and the district attorney was kind of confused why he wasn't invited, but he wasn't, and so we went into the chambers and we sat down, and the conversation lasted about 10 seconds. Gene Franchini looked at my client and said, "Mr. Patterson, you better not let your black ass show up in Lee County again, or you're going to be a dead man." And he said, "You're excused." And
that was it.
And that was it. And my client went back to went back to Lee County, and is still there. And I talk to him occasionally, and I think I talked to him maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And he's enjoying life, and everything's fine.
Any other cases that you can think of that were of interest that?
Oh gosh, I always think I always have thought criminal cases were more interesting than civil cases, although they generally don't make you a good living. They're a lot of fun. I've had a lot of those that have been interesting. The difficulty with criminal cases is waiting for the jury to come back. You're dealing with people's lives as opposed to their bank accounts, and so it's awful stressful. So for that reason, it's not as hard to sit there and wait for a civil jury to come back, because the worst thing you're going to do is not get a big fee, or your client's going to have to pay some money. I've tried several murder cases, and criminal cases, you don't win a lot of them. Defense doesn't win a lot of them, but I've had fair success of them. I've enjoyed federal criminal case work, I think, more than the state, because it's more structured. and all the consequences are more severe since the mandatory sentencing provisions that the Congress passed. But I think in all, I've done more civil work in the last 20 years than I've done criminal work, and I've enjoyed the plaintiff malpractice cases, and I don't know if one's more important than the other.
Let me ask you a question about your work with, have you brought in any younger lawyers to work with? Because you've had a wide range of experience with cases over the years. Have you tried to bring in any younger attorneys to work with you to learn some of the techniques that you've learned the hard way?
I have. I've brought in 2 or 3, but not too many. I brought Billy Blackburn into my office when I was practicing, and worked with him for a couple of years, and tried some cases with him and around the state even, and then he went out on his own and has done very well. Done a couple of others. Kathy, gosh, hadn't thought of this, and I'll think of it in a minute. 2 or 3 others come in, but Billy is the one that I practiced with for 2 or 3 years and did a lot of criminal work with him, and then of course, he's one of the premier criminal defense lawyers now in the state.
Did you have any cases with Jim Brandenburg when he was the DA here in Albuquerque?
You know, I never did. By the time I got over here, he was on his way out, and so I never tried a case against Jim Brandenburg. He was a good man, though. I liked Jim.
What changes have you seen in the practice during your tenure as a
lawyer? Well, I think that's pretty dramatic. The primary change that I've seen in the practice of law is, well, I guess 2 things. One is the long delays in getting to trial because of the backlog of cases. But I think the most dramatic thing I've seen is the lowering of the civility between lawyers over the years. When I was in Clovis, I don't think there was ever a harsh word spoken about anybody on either side of the bench during or after or before trials. Maybe it's because it's a big city, but I think it's more just the general atmosphere in the profession is that the lawyers have simply, a lot of them, not all of them certainly, but a lot of the younger lawyers don't have the kind of respect for the judiciary that I think they should, or have the respect for their opposition, and especially in depositions, but in trial too.
That's an interesting. Can you tell me what you think, looking back, are some of the more significant contributions you've made to law here in New Mexico?
Oh, I don't know that I could point to any one thing that, in terms of legal issues, that I've had any profound effect on. I think that what the profession needs is to engender a respect among the members of the bar for each other and for the judiciary. I really think that is something that's gone downhill, and I feel strongly that adversely affects the public perception of the law and is not good for either side. I think that's really the main thing that I see lacking in this profession right now.
What words of wisdom would you give to young lawyers beginning practice right now?
Well, I think the one thing that I've seen in young lawyers, that other than maybe not having a sufficient amount of respect, is for their opponents and for the bench, is that they don't come prepared for trial and for motions, and I think that they have some idea that all they've got to do is show up, and they're going to be able to present their case and win. But I just see that more often than not, they're not really prepared, as I think the more seasoned members of the bar are, and I'm sure that they will be before they get to that point, or they probably won't be in the practice long.
How big was the bar in Santa Fe when you were practicing up there?
Oh, it was big compared to Clovis. It probably, I would guess they had 150, 200 lawyers there at least. Maybe that's not counting state lawyers. I'm just in the private practice. There were a lot. I tried to practice in Santa Fe. I liked Santa Fe, and had really planned to stay in Santa Fe. But Santa Fe is a pretty cliquish town, and I learned pretty quick that those law firms in Santa Fe had the business pretty well tied up. It was hard to break.
So it's back to Bernalillo County?
It was hard to practice in there.
Well, I remember for a while, at one point in time, that I drove to, I think, Moriarty, and I saw Dave Norvell's office over there, and I think there was one a couple other times. You had some storefront offices around, did you not?
No, I didn't. I never had any.
I thought you had an office in Moriarty. Okay.
No.
Do you have any other aspects of your life or career that you'd like to share with the bar?
Oh, I don't think so. As I indicated, my wife's going to get out of law school here in a while, and I may go back and practice with her. That would be very interesting. I think she's going to make a great lawyer, and it would be nice to be able to kind of help her at that first level to try to break into the practice, which is, law school. At least when I went to law school, they taught you everything except how to practice law. And when you got out of law school, you were on your own. And even though I had a partner in Clovis, when I went to court for the first time, it was almost where in the heck's the courthouse, and what do you do when you get there? It was a learn-as-you-go process. I think the law schools have certainly changed and provided a lot more courses that will prepare lawyers for the profession now than they used to, with moot court and trial practice and stuff like that. But
would you care to comment on how judges have changed over the time, from the times when you first tried cases to the judges today?
Well, I think that I think by and large we got a pretty good judiciary at the federal level. I think ever since I've been in practice, I think that's been the case. I've enjoyed the federal bar. Some of the state bar is, and I think in Albuquerque, we've got some pretty good judges. We've got some that aren't so good, That's why you got the disqualification opportunity, fortunately, in state court, which we had in federal court occasionally. But anyway, I think by and large we get a pretty good judiciary.
Good. We can cut there. Okay. Good spot to stop right there while he changes direction.
Oh, okay.
I haven't got that much more. If you go back into practice with your wife, what guidance would you give her as a new lawyer when you're sitting in the same office with her and about dealing with both people and the courts?
Well, I think not much more than I've already said in that, but I think I wouldn't have to tell her these things because I know that she will be respectful of her peers and respectful of the court. I think I would take a back seat and just watch her proceed and wait for her to ask me if she thought there was anything else that she should do or could do that would promote her side of an issue. I don't intend to be the lead partner in any law firm where she's in. And in fact, I don't know how that's going to work out, but we'll see.
Let me ask a question about your daughter as a lawyer. How did that come about? Did she just tell you, or did you work with her? Or how did that come about?
That's what she wanted to do. I didn't encourage it or discourage it. She went to New Mexico State undergraduate school, and while she was there, she made that decision, and she wanted to go to OU. And after she got out of out of law school, well, I practiced with her. She came in and when I was practicing, and she was with me for about 3 or 4 years, and she didn't care much for the. I don't know if she didn't care about practicing. I mean, the kind of practice I did, or she didn't like practicing with me. But she decided to go down, and she went to Las Cruces and practiced in the DA's office with a friend of hers who went to law school with her, but since then she's been mostly involved in insurance defense work. So I guess it was maybe she didn't like the plaintiff aspect of civil practice, but she's now doing insurance defense work in Dallas.
How did your tenure in the legislature impact on your practice of law throughout New Mexico?
Well, I think it gave me an opportunity probably to, or my political career, not just legislative, but political career, gave me an opportunity to probably become acquainted with most of the judges around the state and most of the lawyers around the state. So I think it helped in that way of just becoming acquainted with a lot more people than I probably would have had I not been in that system, because when you run for statewide office, you get to meet everybody. So,
is there any other aspect of your career or your present occupation that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, I don't think so. I think
Okay.
we've pretty much gone over everything that I can think of that's of relevance.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks.
You bet.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. That's great.